At the edge of an international border, at the edge of the Pacific, at the edge of innovation, community, education, and discovery, you're listening to At the Edge of It All, a University of San Diego podcast where USD experts speak on topics and stories that impact you and the broader community.
Well, hello. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lisette Martinez.
And I'm Elena Gomez, and with us today we have Rachel Locke. She's the director of the Violence, Inequality and Power, or the VIP Lab, at the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego. Thanks for joining us, Rachel.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So let's first just start off with, what is the VIP Lab? Can you kind of explain a little bit of some of the examples of the work that your team does?
Absolutely. So in a nutshell, the VIP Lab is a space to cultivate cutting-edge ideas that confront power and end cycles of violence. There's a sort of idea out there, a predominating idea, that it is poor people or people who are dispossessed or marginalized who cause the majority of violence. And we're actually trying to flip that idea on its head and say that it actually is the holders of resources and power who create the violent systems that the dispossessed, the marginalized, the poor are sort of trapped within. And so we need to put the focus and the energy in the right area if we're going to, in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, really shift systems of inequality and bring violence levels down for the long term.
Rachel, how did you become involved in this type of work?
I've been working in the arena of conflict and violence since really I was in high school in my local Amnesty International club back when I was 15 years old. I have a family history of being on the losing end, if you will, of systems of violence and power entrenchment. And I think that very naturally, sort of these ideas became integrated within me from a young age. Then I started working in the humanitarian field and saw how much energy and resourcing was putting into addressing the consequences of violence and conflict without really what I saw as parallel investment in changing local, national, and global systems that were creating the landscape of conflict and violence. And so I really moved from wanting to address the consequences to wanting to address the causes. And part of the reason for creating the VIP Lab in particular was this sense that with all of the really highly respected work that's being done to address violence and conflict, there remains a sort of unwillingness to confront power. And there remains an unwillingness to confront the ways in which those who really deeply are clutching onto and holding on to power are facilitating violence and violent systems. And that if we don't come at that head on, if we don't address that head on, we're just going to be continuing to spin our wheels.
Do you think most people understand that they are unwilling to let go of this power? Or is this something that happens sometimes unintentionally?
I think it's a little bit the former. So I do think that there is an intentionality amongst those who hold on to power. I do think for the majority of people, it's hard to see these systems, right? They're very, very embedded. They are what we are born into, and they're natural to us because we're born into them. And it takes a sort of re-examination of the system to understand that what we see is something that's been told to us. It may not be natural. So a person who the media has portrayed as a threat for decades, we now see as a threat, even though that's a sort of created identity. It's not something that's natural. So I think it's both. I think it's the holders, it's an intentionality, and for the majority, it's maybe a lack of ability or willingness to peek behind the curtain.
Right. And I think that's where I was trying to get at. Like we can see, for example, in in an example of politics, right? Because, power happens everywhere in small and big in places, but politics is the biggest one, right? I would say, and you can see that politicians want to keep control of their jobs and what they're doing. But for example, in other ways, in our everyday lives, I think that people may not realize that they're part of a structure that is perpetuating something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is part of why the concept is both very challenging and very appealing, right? Because you ask anyone if they understand what power means, and they'll say yes, right? Like, from a very young age, you're a child, your parent has power over you, right? Not in a nefarious or a bad way, but power is a concept that is easy for people to grasp. And also, it's hard sometimes to understand the full complex ways in which that power is being wielded, which run from the political space to the economic space. And, our lives right now are very hard. They're very busy. There's a lot coming at us. There's personal, what you're trying to get through personally, the effects of COVID, all of that. And so taking the time to disaggregate these structures that are intentionally hidden and covert, right, in many ways, or opaque, is asking a lot of people. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is do that peeking behind the curtain in a way that simplifies it a little bit, that says we'll take on the work, provide a different way of looking at a scenario, so that you don't have to take on the work, right? There's enough happening in everybody's lives. But that is, it takes some real focus and intentionality.
Just kind of in tie with that, your team also looks at violence and equality. What are we seeing with that globally? I mean, we are seeing sort of the impacts of the war in Ukraine. Most notably, that's something that we're seeing. But what else are we seeing around the world? Has violence gotten worse around the world? I mean, I'm sure there's so much that we just don't see or don't hear about, but historically, what does that look like?
This is a really hard question to answer. It's a very simple question in many ways, but it's actually a really hard question to answer because the data is not what we want it to be, right, essentially. So in 2014, we had the highest number of armed conflicts since 1947, right? So people who are in my line of work got very animated by this. What's happening? Why is it such an increase? In the most recent data that we have from 2016 to 2020 has shown a significant decrease in all forms of violent deaths. So that includes conflict deaths. It also includes non-conflict, so homicide and interpersonal violence. So that's a real progress point, right? That's something to be to think positively about. But that's 2016 to 2020, and of course 2020 marks COVID. It also marks the large protest movements here in the U.S. that also sparked around the world. So we don't know what will happen in the data from 2020 to today, which makes a little bit the specificity hard to answer. There was real progress with a number of conflicts reducing intensity in those years. So Iraq, Syria, even Yemen and Afghanistan, which remain exceptionally high, violent deaths came down. It doesn't mean other forms of violence didn't go up, and that's important to say. And there was a downward trend in, as well, homicides globally, but not everywhere. So in the U.S., there's been an uptick in homicides, right? So we have to, that question of what are we seeing globally is we're seeing a bumpy ride. We're seeing ups and downs, both from the perspective of conflict and from the perspective of non-conflict violence. We are definitively, and this is important to say, seeing an increase in authoritarianism and centralized power structures, a rise in polarization, a rise in xenophobia. So it is likely that that will lead to increased conflict and violence in the future, but that's not yet borne out in the data necessarily. So we'll see what the data tells us.
Is there reasons for these rises? Is there sort of trends historically that we see that leads to these rises, or is there any sort of explanation as to the why behind it?
In authoritarianism?
Yeah, the rise in violence. Is there some sort of typically historically that you kind of mentioned some ideas, but what is the sort of the why behind it?
Without getting overly technical here, there's various different reasons. Again, it depends on the type of violence. So there's been an increase in availability of weapons. So the material that facilitates violence. There's been an increase in flows in trade and manufacturing of weapons that facilitate violence. There have been various conflicts that have ceased to be conflicts, but have transitioned into violent scenarios. So Colombia is a very good example of this. There was a peace accord that was signed. The conflict with the FARC was ended. But now in some places you're seeing higher levels of violence than you had during the conflict. There has been a noticeable shift in the ability in negotiation, a decreased success, some are predicting, in the power of negotiated settlements around conflict. Some think that this has to do with a rise in extremist and terrorist organizations, with many governments refuse to negotiate with. So if those are the combatants and there's no space for negotiation, then you can't have a negotiated settlement. And so a conflict might remain in stasis for a long period of time. So again, lots of different factors.
Right.
And it's hard to just have one.
But even bringing it down to the individual level, I think everyone can see the rise in threats even on social media, right? You see this in school board meetings. You see these in every aspect of people's lives. It seems like there are so many threats out there, right? So many incidents of violence of all types. Even during the pandemic, we heard about the rise in violence against women, the rise in child abuse. Social media, I can only imagine, has come to make our lives more connected in ways, but also burden us in many other ways as a society.
So social media, like all tools of technology, has both positive and negative benefits. And we've seen concrete examples, and the ones that are often most often cited are Myanmar and India, where social media has been engaged in order to prompt really violent, massive attacks by one group against another. Social media is used to simplify people down to one particular aspect of complex human identities, which contributes to an othering. And we know that othering of certain groups by other groups is a precedent to violence. So social media, by rid of how simple it is, and it's simple by design, extends to the way in which one group of people speaks about another group of people. And that's very dangerous from a conflict perspective. Once you start simplifying people and boiling them down and othering, you're setting the stage for conflict, and you're setting the seeds of fear within people's heads. So certainly we've seen that. Now, we've also seen social media being used to connect groups of people, right? And we've seen social cohesion being built, starting in the online space and moving to the offline space. And we've also seen social media being used to address some of these trends in violence. So when there was stay-at-home orders as part of the COVID-19 response, you saw social media being used to, for example, protect women and children who were within their home with an abuser. So, like all tools, there's both positives and negatives.
So I think we can talk about the problem, Selena, all day long, but I'm very excited about the work that the VIP Lab is doing, and it makes so much sense that it is something grown within the Kroc School here at the University of San Diego, right? The Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies. Can you tell me about the work of the school, which is very unique in the nation when we talk about higher education, and the work that the VIP lab will be doing within that school.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one thing that's important to say up front is that there are many, there's a whole pedagogical focus on war studies. There is not the same pedagogical focus on peace studies. And yet, to really invest in and sustain peace, you need that, right? You need to invest in training the next generation, in improving research and knowledge, in creating strong cohorts, and what every discipline does in order to really create and expand their disciplinary field. And the Kroc School of Peace Studies is one of very few, not just in the nation, but in the world. So it's a pretty special place, I would say. It's also true that what we do at the Institute for Peace and Justice within the Kroc School is take that pedagogical advancement and map it on to sort of real world, actionable partnerships that we have, some of which are here in San Diego, some of which are in Lebanon and Nepal and Belgium and Colombia. We have partnerships all over the world. So it's trying to take the pedagogy of peace, the science, the knowledge, the learning of peace, and bring that to partners, learn from them, learn with them, and put the learning back out. So I am pretty excited about the work that we have with the VIP lab within that context, because it takes that learning, it takes that pedagogy, and it adds this extra layer of power and inequality. And that's an area that, for the most part, the sort of peace studies discipline hasn't really dove into in great depth. So we're sort of adding another layer onto this that I think is pretty exciting and really groundbreaking. It's breaking new ground and new territory, which is exciting.
Thank you so much for talking with us, Rachel. We learned a lot about some of the work that you're doing at the VIP Lab. And if you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe so you can catch our next episode coming up.